History often remembers Egypt for its pyramids, gods, and beauty, but beneath its splendor lay horrors whispered only in secret halls. This is not the tale of Cleopatra or her lovers. It is the story of another queen, erased from marble, forgotten by Rome, and damned by her own priests. They called her the Blood Bride, a woman forced into a marriage meant to unite empires, but instead, she forged her freedom in blood. Her name was Arsinoë, and her story reveals how power devoured women long before history learned to write their screams. In the final century of Egypt's native monarchy, the palace of Alexandria gleamed like a dying star. Its marble corridors still smelled of incense and salt, but the empire it commanded was already rotting from within. Rome had stretched its shadow across the Nile, and the bloodline of pharaohs, once divine, was now a pawn on foreign tables. Among the living relics of that fading dynasty was Princess Arsinoë, daughter of Queen Arsinoë, a woman who had bartered peace through silence and sacrificed daughters for alliances. Arsinoë was 17 when the decree arrived. She would be married to Lord Menkaure of Thebes, a noble of priestly descent, chosen not for his virtue but his allegiance to Rome. The union, the council said, would stabilize Egypt's soul. In truth, it was the final tightening of the noose. The Romans demanded loyalty through marriage. The priests demanded purity through obedience. Between the two, Arsinoë became the body offered to both gods and men. The preparations for the wedding began with ritual cruelty. Her attendants washed her in river water mixed with crushed lotus petals and salt, the scent of sanctity and surrender. They painted her arms with gold dust and wrapped her in linen so tight she could barely breathe. The court poets sang hymns comparing her to Isis, though everyone knew she was being sold, not celebrated. In the reflection of her bridal mirror, Arsinoë did not see a goddess. She saw a prisoner gilded in the color of worship. Her mother's voice haunted the ceremony. A queen's silence is her strongest weapon, Queen Arsinoë had once told her. But Arsinoë wondered, if silence was strength, why did her mother's eyes always look so empty? When Menkaure first visited the palace, Arsinoë stood on the balcony overlooking the harbor, watching his procession arrive. His soldiers marched with Roman discipline, his robes heavy with priestly authority. He was older, his face marked with scars from temple wars and his eyes carrying the cold patience of a man who enjoyed obedience. When he bowed before her, it was not respect, it was ownership. In the days that followed, the palace buzzed with rehearsed joy. Musicians practiced for the wedding, slaves polished the floors until they reflected the torchlight like pools of blood. The citizens would see a spectacle of unity, Egypt's last attempt to look unbroken before Rome's eyes. Only Arsinoë understood that she was the offering placed upon the altar. On the night before her wedding, she stood before the Nile, watching the water move like liquid glass beneath the moon. Fishermen along the far banks sang old hymns to the river goddess, pleading for calm tides. Arsinoë whispered a different prayer, not for peace, but for remembrance. If she must die as a bride, she hoped the river would carry her name longer than her husband's victory. When dawn broke, the drums of Alexandria thundered. The princess of Egypt walked toward her wedding not as a bride, but as a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled, veiled, silent, and already mourning the woman she would have been. The wedding of Arsinoë and Lord Menkaure was less a union and more a conquest dressed in gold. Alexandria's great temple to Hathor overflowed with nobles, priests, and Roman envoys, each bearing gifts wrapped in silk and hypocrisy. The scent of incense masked the stench of fear. Slaves lined the marble aisles, their heads bowed as the high priest invoked the goddess of love to bless a bond that had already been sealed in politics and deceit. Arsinoë stood at the altar, her body bound in ceremonial linen, her face hidden behind a sheer golden veil. The weight of her crown pressed into her skull, each jewel like a reminder of her duty. Menkaure approached in robes dyed with crushed pomegranate, the color of victory, the color of blood. He did not look at her as a husband might, but as a commander studies new territory. When he took her hand, his fingers pressed too tightly, marking possession before witnesses. The crowd cheered. Rome's envoy smiled. Egypt had traded its last breath for applause. That night, the queen was escorted to the bridal chamber, a room of alabaster walls and burning oil lamps that smelled of myrrh and honey. The attendants withdrew, and silence fell, a silence so complete she could hear her own pulse. Menkaure removed her veil, not with tenderness, but with impatience. His eyes, hard and assessing, lingered as though searching for flaws in a statue he had purchased. When she turned her face away, his hand caught her jaw, forcing her to look at him. "You are Egypt," he murmured. "And Egypt obeys." The ritual that followed was not one of union but submission. The queen's body became the battlefield on which power was proven. In the temple archives, chroniclers would later describe the night as the sacred joining of two dynasties. But in truth, it was the night Arsinoë learned that a crown could be heavier in bed than on her head. In the days that followed, Menkaure's rule over her was absolute. He forbade her from addressing the council without permission, restricted her movement within the palace, and dismissed her loyal handmaidens. He replaced them with women from his own house, spies disguised as servants. Each morning she was dressed in splendor, painted and perfumed, made to stand beside him during public ceremonies like a decorative idol while he proclaimed decrees. Her smile became part of his rule. Whispers spread through the corridors of the palace like smoke. Servants noticed the bruises hidden beneath her bangles, the way she flinched when Menkaure's shadow crossed the floor. They said her eyes no longer blinked when he entered, that she had learned to stare through him, as though memorizing the distance between her soul and his cruelty. But in the depths of her silence, something began to harden. The same voice that once trembled with fear now whispered beneath her breath, a vow not spoken aloud but carved into her mind. She would endure long enough to learn his weaknesses. The serpent that survives does not strike in haste. At the next public ceremony, Menkaure announced the beginning of a new age, an empire sanctified by obedience. The nobles applauded. Arsinoë stood beside him, her face serene, her heart an iron weight. In that moment, beneath the cheers of the court, she realized the truth. Her marriage was not her imprisonment. It was her disguise. And behind that mask of gold, the blood bride began to awaken. The great feast of Alexandria was meant to display harmony, Egypt's strength renewed under its new rulers. In truth, it was a theater of humiliation. Every noble, every merchant, every Roman envoy was summoned to witness the queen's submission dressed as celebration. The palace glowed with torchlight. Its pillars hung with red silk that fluttered like the tongues of 1,000 watching snakes. At the center of the hall stood Menkaure, radiant in gold armor, his smile a weapon polished for politics. Arsinoë sat beside him on a smaller throne, her body draped in white linen embroidered with sapphires, a bride still, though her wedding was months past. The light reflected from the jewels could not reach her eyes. She watched the dancers, the musicians, the endless toasts made to her husband's victories over the Nubian border tribes. For each boast, the courtiers laughed louder, drinking wine until their tongues loosened and their dignity drowned. When the Roman envoy rose to speak, the tone shifted. He congratulated Menkaure not merely as a ruler, but as a loyal friend to Rome, a phrase that sliced deeper than any blade. The words were a reminder that Egypt's throne now sat beneath a foreign shadow. Menkaure's pride flared. He needed a show of dominance to reclaim the illusion of power. His eyes turned to his queen. He lifted a cup of wine, its rim carved with the symbol of Anubis, and handed it to her. "Drink," he commanded softly, loud enough for the guests to hear. "To your husband's glory." The hall fell still. Arsinoë's fingers trembled around the goblet. Every gaze turned toward her, not with sympathy, but hunger for scandal. A queen refusing a toast was a queen defying a king. And defiance, in this palace, was an unforgivable sin. Her lips brushed the cup, but did not drink. The wine caught the torchlight like blood in a chalice. For a long, breathless moment, nothing moved. Then Menkera smiled, slow, cruel, and gestured toward the servants waiting by the walls. "If my queen will not drink," he said, "then let those who taught her insolence share her shame." The attendants, young women who had once served Arsinoë since childhood, were dragged forward by guards. Their cries echoed off marble, swallowed by the music that resumed as if on command. The guests looked away, pretending not to hear the sounds that followed. The queen sat motionless, her nails biting into her palms, her throat burning with the scream she could not release. When the feast ended, the musicians were dismissed, and the guests stumbled out into the night, pretending to remember nothing. Arsinoë walked to the terrace overlooking the Nile. Below, the moonlight shimmered on dark water and on what floated within it. Her handmaidens, bound and lifeless, drifted along the current like discarded offerings. Behind her, Menkera's footsteps echoed. "Disobedience is contagious," he said quietly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Now you will remember what loyalty costs." He left her there, frozen before the river, where the scent of incense mixed with the stench of death. That night, Arsinoë did not weep. Something colder settled inside her, a silence that no longer begged for mercy. She realized that in Menkera's world, obedience was not survival. It was slow extinction. And for the first time, the queen began to imagine a different kind of devotion, one written not in vows, but in vengeance. In the weeks after the feast, silence became Arsinoë's only companion. The palace, once alive with laughter, music, and the fragrance of lotus, now reeked of burnt offerings and fear. Every corridor seemed to whisper the names of her murdered attendants. The river still carried their ghosts, and in the night breeze, she could almost hear the soft ripples of their passing. Menkera had returned to his councils and rituals, parading himself before priests and envoys as Egypt's divine ruler. Yet behind the marble walls, the queen he had broken began to piece herself back together, not with hope, but with hate. Her chamber was her prison. She was allowed neither visitors nor letters. The guards stationed at her doors bowed stiffly, never meeting her eyes. Only one servant remained, an elderly woman named Hesse, once her mother's nursemaid. Hesse spoke rarely and moved like a shadow, her devotion born not of duty but of memory. One night, while tending to the queen's wounds, she whispered the name no one else dared speak, Thaleia, Arsinoë's mother. "She too wore chains beneath her jewels," Hesse murmured. "And when they grew too heavy, she found freedom in her own blood." The words struck Arsinoë like a blade. Her mother, remembered by history as graceful and obedient, had died by her own hand rather than endure another forced union. It was said she had used a dagger of carved ivory, a relic passed through generations of queens. The weapon had vanished after her death, buried by servants to hide her shame. 3 nights later, Hesse returned, her hands trembling around a small bundle wrapped in linen. Inside lay that same dagger, its ivory handle cracked, its blade dulled by years of concealment. "It belonged to your mother," she said. "Use it for what she could not finish." Arsinoë stared at the dagger for a long time. The reflection in its blade was distorted, but clear enough to show the woman she had become, pale, hollow-eyed, unrecognizable. She turned toward the mirror beside her bed, the same one that had once reflected her beauty during her coronation. Now it reflected her decay. Her face looked older, her gaze emptied of youth. The Queen of Egypt stared back not as a victim, but as an omen. The mirror became her confessor. Each night she stood before it, whispering words she could not say aloud. "I am not my mother," she said. "I will not die for a man's peace." Her silence, once a cage, now became her armor. Every insult, every bruise, every command from Menkera became a stone in the foundation of something rising within her. a plan that would require patience sharper than any blade. She began to watch him differently. When he entered the chamber, she noted the servants who followed, the guards who shifted their eyes, the moments he grew careless. She learned the rhythm of his cruelty, when his anger peaked, when his arrogance blinded him. Her tears ceased. Her gaze hardened. Even the guards began to avoid her stare, whispering that the queen no longer slept, that she watched the moon like a priest watches an omen. One evening, she lifted the dagger toward the mirror. Its blade trembled in her grip, reflecting both her face and the darkness behind her. "If I must bleed," she whispered, "it will not be mine." And with that vow, the blood bride was born. Night fell over Alexandria like a mourning veil. The palace, still outwardly radiant, had become a tomb of quiet cruelty. Each torch that burned in the corridors flickered against walls that had witnessed too much obedience. The laughter of nobles had long since died. Only whispers remained, thin, trembling things that hid behind doors and beneath floors. Within her chamber, Queen Arsinoë sat before her extinguished mirror, her face half lit by a single oil lamp. Around her, the silence was alive, not empty, but waiting. The dagger of her mother lay concealed beneath silk, no longer a symbol of despair, but of possibility. Yet Arsinoë knew one blade alone could not topple an empire. She would need voices, silent ones, desperate ones, and patience enough to weave rebellion from fear itself. It began with a prayer. In the palace's forgotten chapel, a small marble room below the east wing, the queen knelt before the altar at dusk. To any guard, it looked like penance. But as her head bowed, the women around her began to speak softly, their words fragmented, hidden between hymns. Concubines, widows, slaves, all discarded by Menkara's court, gathered in that space where gods had long stopped listening. They came to her as broken things. One bore the scars of lashes across her back. Another had her tongue partially cut for gossip. The youngest had seen her child taken by Menkara's soldiers as payment for silence. Arsinoë looked upon them not as subjects, but as mirrors, each one reflecting what she might soon become. At first, they spoke of survival. How to avoid Menkara's gaze. How to hide bruises from the guards. How to live through another night. But slowly, their words changed. They spoke of the bodies thrown into the Nile, of the screams smothered behind curtains, of the endless sacrifices demanded by men who called themselves gods. What began as prayer turned into confession, and confession, under the weight of suffering, transformed into planning. Arsinoë never spoke directly of rebellion, not yet. She asked questions instead. Who guarded the storerooms? Which priests handled the ceremonial wine? Which servants cleaned the royal chalices? Each answer became a thread. Each whisper, a weapon. Hesse, the old nursemaid, moved between them like a ghost, carrying messages hidden inside folded linens or hollowed fruit. Beneath the palace, in the servants' tunnels carved from limestone centuries earlier, they met in darkness. The walls absorbed their words. The air carried their resolve. No man suspected the queen who prayed each morning was building an army of the forgotten. The women called themselves nothing, swore no oaths, and bore no banners. Their rebellion was stitched together by grief. When they prayed not to Hathor or Isis, but to the memory of those drowned in the Nile. Arsinoë watched them grow bolder. The slaves began to steal keys. The widows memorized guard rotations. The concubines learned which herbs could sicken a man without killing him, yet each small act went unnoticed, dismissed as coincidence. The palace believed in the queen's submission, and that belief was their blindness. Sometimes in the dead of night, Arsinoë wondered if what she was building was truly freedom or another form of damnation. But then she remembered the feast, the floating bodies, and her mother's bloodied dagger. Mercy, she decided, was a language of the weak. By dawn, the women dispersed, returning to their stations, faces calm, voices silent, hearts newly alive. Above them, the palace continued its rituals of power and prayer, unaware that beneath its sacred floors, a storm was learning how to whisper. And soon, it would learn how to scream. The sun rose over Alexandria, gilded and deceitful, its light spilling over banners of gold and crimson that fluttered from the palace terraces. Trumpets announced a day of triumph, King Menkaura's victory over the Nubian rebels. Courtiers and foreign envoys flooded the marble courtyards, bringing gifts and praise for the living god who conquered chaos. From her balcony, Queen Arsinoë watched the spectacle unfold below. The air stank of incense and arrogance. Her husband's voice carried above the crowd, booming, theatrical, hollow. The man who once made her tremble now looked smaller in her eyes, wrapped in his delusion of divinity. She touched the scar beneath her necklace, the faint mark left by his hand months before, and let her fingers linger there like a vow. This festival, she knew, would be his last. For weeks, the Chamber of Whispers had been preparing, a silent chorus of women moving beneath the notice of gods and guards. The plan was simple, delicate, and devastating. During the victory feast, the queen would serve the ceremonial wine, a gesture of devotion performed before priests, generals, and foreign guests. The wine, however, would not be pure. The idea had come from Hesi, who remembered the old physicians of Thalia's time. Hidden among the herbs of the royal apothecary was a rare extract, desert hemlock, a venom that paralyzed the lungs while keeping the mind awake. The aged physician who once served Arsinoë's mother, long dismissed by Menkaura, still lingered in the city's underbelly. He had been waiting for a reason to finish what Thalia had begun. In the nights before the festival, Arsinoë met him in the palace gardens under the cover of prayer. His hands shook as he measured the dose. Too little would fail, too much would betray her. He will not die swiftly, the physician warned. He will see his godhood rot in his throat. Arsinoë only nodded. Let him choke on his divinity. When the day arrived, she dressed in white linen and lapis, the color of mourning disguised as purity. Her attendants braided her hair with gold, unaware their trembling queen was carrying a vial of death hidden within her sleeve. The feast began with spectacle, dancers, music, chants to rewrote on Horus. Menkaura sat on his gilded throne, surrounded by priests and Roman envoys, his eyes glimmering with victory and wine. When Arsinoë approached with the ceremonial chalice, the hall fell into reverent silence. She knelt before him, lifting the cup to his lips, her voice steady, her eyes lowered. "To the God who conquers all," she said. He drank. For a moment, nothing happened. The musicians resumed, laughter echoed, the court exhaled. Then his smile faltered. A tremor passed through his hand. The golden cup slipped, spilling red across the marble like a prophecy fulfilled. His body convulsed. His jaw clenched. His eyes rolled toward the ceiling as foam gathered at his lips. The priests rushed forward, chanting prayers, but their voices drowned beneath the gasps of nobles and soldiers. One Roman envoy crossed himself. Another fled. The air filled with panic. Arsinoë stood still. Her hands trembled beneath her veil, hidden from view, but her face remained serene, the image of a grieving wife. When Menkaura collapsed, choking on his own breath, the high priest fell to his knees and cried, "The gods punish arrogance." The queen bowed her head. "So they do," she whispered. That night, as the body of Egypt's god-king twitched under the weight of his own poison, the queen prayed not for forgiveness but for silence. Because true vengeance, she knew, rarely needed witnesses. The dawn after the festival did not bring mourning. It brought chaos. Menkaura, the god-king of Egypt, still breathed, shallow, ragged, defiant. The poison had not killed him. It had only unmasked him. His tongue hung useless, his body seized in spasms, and his priests whispered that the divine had been struck by judgment. But to the Romans, it was not the gods they saw punished, it was politics. Before the sun had risen twice, the queen was seized. Guards entered her chamber at midnight, the scent of smoke and oil clinging to their armor. She did not resist when they tore the veil from her face. She did not speak when they shackled her wrists in bronze. The whispering halls where she had plotted now echoed only with the sound of footsteps and betrayal. By dawn, she stood before the Hall of the Crocodile, the sacred tribunal where traitors of the crown were judged. The massive doors opened to a crowd of nobles, priests, and Roman envoys. The air was thick with sweat and fear. Her throne had been stripped from the dais, replaced by a single chair carved of stone. At its center sat the high priest of Sobek, his face painted in green and black. To his left, Roman prefect Marcus Varro, a man whose loyalty was measured in bribes, not blood. And before them, Queen Arsinoë, still wearing the torn white linen from the night before. Her husband was not present. Menkaure lay somewhere in the temple chambers, paralyzed, his priests claiming the gods demanded his silence. The accusations began like thunder. Treason, sacrilege, attempted regicide. Each word struck like a lash. The priests recited scripture, twisting devotion into law. The Romans demanded an example, for the empire's allies could not appear weak. And as they argued, Arsinoë simply watched. When her turn to speak came, she rose, her chains clinking softly. "Last night," she said, her voice steady, "the gods judged him. I merely poured the cup." Gasps filled the hall. The high priest's hand trembled over his scroll. Varro leaned forward. "Then you confess?" "I confess," she said, "that Egypt was dying, that its people starved while their king built temples to his name, that men worshipped his cruelty and women were buried in his pleasure. If that is sin, then I am guilty." Silence followed, long and electric. The priest avoided her eyes. The nobles looked away. For the first time, the court saw her not as a queen or prisoner, but as something ancient, something righteous. But justice in Egypt had never belonged to the pure. The verdict came before dusk. She was stripped of her crown, her royal name erased from every tablet and scroll. Her mother's tomb was sealed. Her servants were scattered. She was to be executed by drowning, the same fate once given to false priestesses who defied the temple. As the guards dragged her from the hall, a Roman envoy whispered to another, "Her courage is a curse. Kill her quickly." She turned her head, eyes catching his. "Curses," she murmured, "are the only gifts left to queens." That night, she was locked in her chamber, awaiting the dawn that would end her life. Yet even as the priests prepared their rituals and the Romans their reports, whispers began once more beneath the palace floors. The discarded women, the widows, the slaves, those who had conspired with her, were still there. Still breathing. Still waiting. And when the first torchlight flickered against the horizon, Egypt would remember that silence is never loyalty, it is the breath before the scream. The night before the execution was meant to be silent. The priests had ordered all lamps extinguished in the queen's corridor, a sign of mourning before death. Yet in the dark, another light began to grow. It began in the servants' quarters, a torch held by a trembling hand. One of the washerwomen, a widow whose son Menkaure had conscripted and killed, lit the first flame. Another followed, and another. Within an hour, the palace of Alexandria, built of cedar and marble, lined with incense and idols, began to breathe fire. The rebellion was not an army. It was a chorus of women who had long learned to speak without words. They had waited, pretending obedience, their silence sharpening into resolve. When the guards drank their nightly wine, the conspirators moved. Oil was spilled in corridors, veils torn into wicks, prayer candles thrown against drapery soaked in perfume. Inside her locked chamber, Queen Arsinoë heard the sound, distant at first, then near. A muffled scream. the thud of sandals running, and then the unmistakable roar of flame. She rose from the floor, chains dragging behind her. The air filled with smoke and the smell of burning myrrh. Moments later, the door burst open. A figure entered, scarred, veiled, and breathless. "My queen," she whispered. "The gods have answered." It was Nefret, one of her former handmaidens, thought dead after the feast of shame. She carried a dagger blackened with soot. Arsinoë did not ask how she had survived. She only said, "Unchain me." As Nefret struck the locks with a hammer, another explosion shook the palace. The northern corridor, where Menkara's sacred chambers stood, had caught fire. Statues of Horus and Osiris melted, their gold faces dripping like tears. Guards ran through the chaos, some fighting the blaze, others slashing at rebels they could not see through the smoke. The queen stepped barefoot into the inferno. Flames licked her gown, but she did not flinch. The same halls where she once walked as a bride now became her battlefield. Every painting, every polished urn, every gilded idol was a reminder of her humiliation, and now her reckoning. As she moved through the corridors, women followed her. Slave girls, cooks, and widows armed with kitchen blades. Together they cut down guards, doused torches in oil, and turned prayer into rebellion. The palace screamed, not as a war, but as a confession. Somewhere in the chaos, Menkara's voice echoed, hoarse, unrecognizable. He had crawled from his chambers, half poisoned, his once perfect body broken. When he saw the queen through the smoke, he called her name. She stopped. For a moment, silence reigned between them. Then the ceiling above him cracked. Fire consumed the tapestries that bore his lineage. As the beams collapsed, Arsinoë turned away. "Let the gods finish what I began," she whispered. By midnight, Alexandria's skyline was red. The harbor glowed with reflected flame, and the city's citizens gathered on rooftops to watch the fall of their rulers. Some prayed, others cheered, and within the palace walls, the queen led her followers to the central courtyard, where fountains once sang with lotus water. Now they ran black with ash. When dawn finally neared, the fire began to die, not from rain, but from exhaustion. What remained was ruin, silence, and the faint sound of footsteps. Women walking barefoot over the embers of their freedom. The palace of Menkara, once called the House of the Eternal Sun, was no more. Egypt had witnessed a miracle, not divine salvation, but divine retribution. And somewhere in the smoke, the blood bride of the Nile rose from her ashes, her chains glowing red, her eyes reflecting a fire the world would never forget. By dawn, the city of Alexandria had turned to smoke. The sea breeze carried ash across the harbor, and the temples stood silent, their gods blackened by soot. The great palace of Menkara, once the heart of Egypt's final dynasty, was now a skeleton of ruin. From the marble courtyard to the royal chambers, everything that had once shimmered was buried beneath flame and collapse. The golden mosaics of the gods cracked like broken mirrors. The corridors that had echoed with hymns now held only the hiss of dying embers. At the center of this devastation sat Queen Arsinoë, blood drying on her face, her linen gown charred into her skin. She no longer looked like a woman of flesh, but a relic, something forged by fire, unbent and unholy. Around her lay the bodies of those who had followed her. Nefret, the widow from the kitchens, the concubines who had whispered freedom, the slaves who had carried torches through the night. They were strewn across the courtyard, still clutching the weapons they had fashioned from their servitude. They had not fought for gold or crowns. They had fought to die free. The fire had consumed everything but the throne. The gilded seat of Menkara, blackened and twisted, still stood. The queen walked toward it, slow, limping, every step an agony. When she sat upon it, the molten metal seared through her gown, fusing the broken crown into her hair. She did not scream. She smiled, because in that moment, She had become what no man could make her, sovereign by her own will. Outside the palace walls, the rebellion was collapsing. Roman garrisons marched through the city, their armor reflecting the last light of the burning palace. They had come not to save Egypt, but to secure it, to ensure that the empire's newest province did not vanish in smoke. When they reached the gates, they found no soldiers to fight, only the dead and a queen sitting upon a throne of ruin. Prefect Marcus Varro entered first, his face pale with disbelief. "By the gods," he muttered, "she's still alive." Arsinoë lifted her head. Her eyes, red from smoke, met his without fear. "Tell Rome," she said quietly, "that Egypt no longer bows." Varro looked around at the dead guards, at the melted idols, at the rising embers. "You've destroyed your own kingdom." She gave a faint laugh, one that trembled with exhaustion. "No," she whispered. "I buried a corpse." When he ordered his men to seize her, none dared to touch her. She was burned, bleeding, but terrible in her stillness. Some swore that when she rose, her crown glowed as if alive, though it was only molten gold cooling upon her scalp. By midday, the flames had died. The palace smoldered. The Romans claimed the ruins, declaring Menkera dead and Arsinoë a traitor. Her body was carried away in silence, though some say she still breathed as they took her. In the days that followed, her name was erased. The priests of Sobek called her a blasphemer. Roman scribes labeled her a mad queen. But in the alleyways of Alexandria, the surviving women spoke her name in whispers, not as curse, but as prayer. They called her the blood bride of the Nile, the woman who killed her god to free her soul. And as night returned to the silent harbor, her legend rose higher than the smoke, a story not of ruin, but of awakening. For Egypt had lost its crown that day, but it had found its voice. Weeks passed. The flames that had devoured the palace were finally gone, leaving only the smell of wet ash and salt drifting over the harbor. The heart of Alexandria, once the crown of Egypt's pride, had become a mausoleum of stone and soot. Menkera's banners had been torn down. The statues of his divinity toppled and thrown into the sea. The dynasty that had once called itself eternal was erased in less than a month. The Romans arrived not as conquerors, but as caretakers of ruin. Prefect Marcus Varro ordered the palace sealed and the survivors questioned. None spoke. The women who had followed the queen refused to utter her name. Some claimed she had died in the fire. Others swore she had been taken by the river, walking into the Nile at dawn, her crown melting into the current. No body was ever found. Rome declared the rebellion a divine collapse. Egypt was annexed as a province, its temples repurposed for imperial tribute, its gods renamed, its tongue slowly buried under Latin stone. The scribes rewrote history, turning Menkera into a martyr and Arsinoë into a warning. Her name was scrubbed from papyrus scrolls, her portraits shattered, her seal melted down. The last queen of Egypt was erased by the ink of men who feared the memory of a woman who had chosen her own fate. But history, like fire, leaves embers. In the ruins of the queen's private chamber, beneath the blackened ceiling where her execution chains still hung, a Roman scribe uncovered a sealed urn of alabaster. Inside lay a single scroll, preserved in wax, written in Arsinoë's own hand. Its words were few, but they burned deeper than flame. A bride's duty is to bleed for her kingdom. I chose whose blood it would be. No confession, no remorse, only choice. Varro ordered the scroll hidden in the archives of the Serapeum, calling it evidence of madness. Yet decades later, when the temple itself was destroyed, a copy of those words resurfaced among the papyri of a Greek historian. From then on, whispers of the blood bride spread across the Mediterranean, from merchant ports to desert monasteries, from brothels to libraries. They said she had become a spirit of vengeance, not a ghost, but an idea. A queen who refused to die silent. Mothers would whisper her story to their daughters in secret, of the woman who turned a wedding into a war, who burned her crown to free her soul. Centuries would pass. Empires would rise, and Egypt would forget her name, but the legend endured in fragments. Some scholars argued she never existed. Others insisted her deeds were absorbed into the myth of Cleopatra's fall, rewritten by Rome to bury a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. Yet in the stillness of those ancient halls, one truth remained. The empire that silenced her also silenced itself. The dynasty that chained her perished with her flames. When night falls over the ruins of Alexandria, fishermen still claim to see faint light beneath the waves, the shimmer of gold, the outline of a crown, and the whisper of a woman's voice carried by the Nile wind. Not weeping, not pleading, just whispering the same words she wrote before the end. A bride's duty is to bleed for her kingdom. I chose whose blood it would be. And with those words, the story of Egypt's last true queen faded into the silence after empire, where memory burns longer than fire. And truth, though buried, still breathes.